I'm Bill Fulton, the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University in Houston, and welcome to the Kinder Institute Forum. The KI Forum series brings thought leaders from around the world to share ideas about today's most pressing urban issues. And today we're thrilled to have Shin-pei Tsay, who is the Global Director of Cities and Transportation for Uber. We ask that you tweet using hashtag KI Forum. And if you want to follow us on Twitter, you can do that with @RiceKinderInst. Kinder Institute Forum Series is made possible thanks to our friends at PNC Bank. PNC is a wonderful sponsor of the Kinder Institute and the title sponsor of this lecture series. And I'd like to introduce Julie Suddath, Regional President of PNC in Houston, to give us a few brief remarks. Julie, welcome and thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Bill. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie Young-Suddath, Regional President for PNC Bank in Houston. And it is certainly my privilege, as always, to welcome you all today as we learn more about what we can do as a community to improve the Houston metro area. As many of you know, PNC recently became the 4th largest bank in Houston with the completion of our acquisition of BBVA USA. And while we are now much larger, our strategy has not changed since we came into the market 4 years ago. We are a Main Street bank, and as such, we're deeply committed to investing in the Houston region's future. We do this in a variety of ways, and one of those is supporting amazing community partners like the Kinder Institute. As a Rice alum, it's certainly an honor to take part in these forums and to be the presenting sponsor. This forum series and the leading experts that take part in it offer a level of accessibility to top insights that you'll be hard pressed to find anywhere else. I have no doubt this will be the case once again today with Shin-pei Tsay, Global Head of Cities and Transportation at Uber, giving us her expert thoughts on sustainable and inclusive transportation, among other topics. I'm very excited to listen to what she has to say, and thank you again for joining. And with that, I'm happy to turn it back over to Bill Fulton, who will kick off the program. Bill?
Thank you, Julie. In addition to PNC, which is the primary sponsor for this a series of lectures, generous support for Kinder Institute comes from a multi-year grant from Houston Endowment. The Institute relies on philanthropic investments from many other contributors, including Nancy and Rich Kinder and the Kinder Foundation, Laura and Tom Bacon, the Baxter Trust, Chevron, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the JP Morgan Chase Foundation, Wells Fargo, the WT Grant Foundation, Bank of America, PNC Bank, the Spencer Foundation, Claire and Eric Anya, Arnold Ventures, Bracewell LLP, Centerpoint Energy, Catherine and Hank Coleman, HEB, Sis and Hasty Johnson, Becky and Ralph O'Connor, United Way of Greater Houston, and Willie Nanayakara and Associates. I'd now like to introduce our speaker for the day, Shin-pei Tsay. Shin-pei is the Global Head of Cities and Transportation at Uber, where she leads a team focused on creating a sustainable, inclusive, and multimodal future. Shin-pei's had a very distinguished career. She has held leadership positions in various organizations, including the Gell Institute and Transit Center, I think at Carnegie Endowment, which is where you were there when we first met, if I recall that correctly, Shin-pei. Prior to joining Uber, she founded Make Public, a social impact analysis firm that specializes in the public realm. And in 2021, she was named a sustainability star by Adweek. Once again, if you want to pose a question while Shin-pei is talking, please put it in the Q&A box. If you like a question, you want to move it up, just click like, and I'll get to the Q&A when Shin-pei is done with her presentation. So I'm happy to turn it over to you now. Welcome to the Kinder Institute. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am just sorry that I'm not in person with all of you in Houston that are dialing in, but hopefully there are other people around the country or the world that are joining us today. It's really, really great to be here. And what I'm going to do is I have a bit of a presentation I wanted to share with you. So I'm going to get that going. I just wanted to start with a few thoughts. I personally am emerging from a very, very reclusive life, a very privileged one, I have to say. I hadn't had to worry about shelter or food or work, but it was very, very isolated and with the pandemic. And I think that these last couple of years has really shown us just how stark our inequities are. That access to movement is so unequal. We have unequal access to safe spaces, to better choices, to healthcare, to work opportunities, rights, and to movement of all forms. And really, movement is a privilege today, not a right. And I think this is something that I've really focused on for all of my time, my professional life, is just this belief it doesn't have to be that way. I'm gonna, if you indulge me, share a little bit of a personal story. This is the house I grew up in Syracuse. It's a very suburban setting. It was on a cul-de-sac. And this is where my friends were, and this is where my school was, and it was incredibly difficult to walk. That was the exit, and it was just so hard to get to places that were really very, very close by. This was my experience if I did want to attempt to getting to see people. And so it ultimately was a very isolated experience. This is, as a kid growing up. And it wasn't really until I became an adult and I got a chance to be in a city, take transit, that I felt both much more connected and much more independent. So both things at once. But that's, lots of people have this experience. And I would say, it's not so much that this person is walking, it's that he's walking in such a dangerous environment that the infrastructure isn't there to support him if this is a choice, but also given the environment, this may not have been a first choice if he needed to get somewhere. And we see this all the time in the way that we think about our built environment, in the way that we think about how are we setting people up to take transportation. And in this case, this is a bus stop that I would say it would be initially hard to find and hard to get to and quite dangerous. Transportation is inequitable based on cost. The lowest income households bear the greatest burden disproportionately. And it's also inequitable based on time. So it's a really cool equity map that Transit Center and CNT pulled together to show how much time it takes. In this case, each dot, I believe in this map, is a low income household, and it's the travel time to urgent care. So the majority of the region, and where there are clusters of more low-income households, it takes quite a significant amount of time to get to something that is essentially a critical destination. And we know also that in spite of all these inequities, that we can't go on continuing doing things the way that we have been doing them for transportation. It's completely unsustainable. It's growing. It's a huge part of emissions, but it's also growing. And you might say at this point, Shin-pei, I know that you're going to talk about sustainability and transportation, and you're working at Uber. And we just, Uber is a ride-hail company. It is a platform with vehicles. What are you talking about? How does this connect to all the things that you've done? Don't you remember this? Don't you remember this principle of, moving people, not vehicles? How about this? You were on the Public Design Commission in New York. You worked with Gail. You were focused on urban design. And I would say that actually I had this really transformative experience when I was actually working in bicycle advocacy, where I met Reverend Robert Enos Jackson and Reverend Devani Jackson. They ran an organization called the Brooklyn Rescue Mission. This was many, many years ago, before the most recent racial equity conversations and movement. And we were working together on Healthy Communities Project, cross-collaborative, philanthropically funded, cross-agency in New York City. And I would often go and visit them at their farm. They turned this beautiful, this is their farm, it's Bed-Stuy Urban Farm. It was a garbage dump. People would just drop trash there, and they turned this beautiful farm, and they were feeding people in the neighborhood. They had a food bank, and they were also working on the policy side, which is how I met them. Of course, I was representing the bicycle advocates at the time, or the walking advocates at the time. So let's say the sustainable transportation advocates at the time. And they, you know, I would go visit them at the farm and we talk about different things that people are facing in the community. And at some point, you know, both reverends just said to me, Shin-pei, do you know what it's like for a Black man to be running down the street, what that looks like? We need things today. We can't wait for conditions to change for us to be able to walk and bike safely. We want to be able to do things. There are things we need today. And that really stuck with me as I went and tried lots of different initiatives to continue to work on how do we increase access for people with great urgency to meet the needs of today, and to not expect people to wait for something to come along. And it's not to say that we shouldn't be building for the future, and it's not to say that all those kinds of things aren't worthwhile. It's to say that we have to do all. We have to think about today as much as we're thinking about tomorrow. As we're thinking about tomorrow, actually, our land use patterns and the current practices and policy structures aren't painting a very, very encouraging picture in terms of sustainable transportation. The vast majority of miles traveled way into the future will still be in private cars. And you'll see that public transit at least is kind of holding on. I think it should be a bigger piece of the pie here, or the bigger chunk of the chart. And then, you know, the other pieces are quite small. And so I think that we have to really think about how we can, you know, make this blue a lot less blue and really build up the other colors in this chart. I think these modes are interdependent. There was a study in 2019, a survey of transit riders, thousands of transit riders that Transit Center organized, that said that started to show that these are mutually reinforcing. And if you look at national travel data, person trips by mode in urban households with cars will always will have a greater and stronger preference for taking their car. And once you take your car out of the house, you're stuck with the car all day long for every trip. But if you can have all the options at your fingertips, you are much more able to leave the house and catch a bus, take a bike. And then there's a role for ride hail to be mobility insurance. We're actually seeing more and more evidence of ride hail as mobility insurance. This is a chart from a study we commissioned from WXY Studio based in New York City, an award-winning urban design and architecture studio. And they took a look at the data that we had from April 2020 to March 2021 and saw that low-income neighborhoods were actually using Uber faster and more consistently than upper-income neighborhoods during those months of the pandemic. So it's not to say they use it more, it's to say that they may be dependent on it in ways that we don't really give people enough visibility into. The other thing in the large scheme of working on reducing carbon emissions and being inclusive is that we need all of these different strategies to work together. ITDP recently put out this report that they shared at COP26, which shows that walking, biking, transit with electrification is really the future scenario that is needed to keep us at 1.5 degree warming. So that's the target in terms of climate warming that the global climate change community is working towards, and all the nation states are trying to hold each other to. And so it's really interesting to see this model. And so what I wanted to point out is all of these things have to work together. Public transit, car-free Sundays in large cities, one of my favorite events. We need, and electrification. All these things have to work together. So that's really why I am focused on this here. And that's the way I think about the work that we're doing. And as much as we're doing all of these things on the policy side, we should be doing everything we can at the same time to meet the needs of people as they have them today. So Uber is a really interesting company for me. It's the biggest company I've ever worked for. And I was really interested in also the scale, right? 71 countries, over 10,000 cities, 118 million active consumers. And again, I think back to the reverends I talked to, we can't do this always project by project. I was really interested in thinking about things at a much greater scale, at a faster pace. And with this many consumers, you're starting to get into the mainstream. We're not just talking to the converted. We're not just talking to people who are already riding their bicycle and already wanting to walk. We're talking to people that, they probably have 2 to 3 cars sometimes, and trying to get them to really think about these issues as well. So one way I like to think about this is we imagine the way the world moves for the better. And did I just go backwards? And for the better for climate change. And one of the things that we were able to do over the last couple of years at Uber was to make a carbon commitment. I think it was really impressive to me, interesting that we were able to do this in the middle of a pandemic. It's not like the policies, the supportive policies are in place. This is a huge step, but what we are trying to aspire to is to provide 100% rise in zero emission vehicles in micromobility and transit in the US, Canada, and Europe by 2030 and globally by 2040. So that does include EVs, but also micromobility and transit. And we're really looking at ways that we can make that possible across the platform, entire platform, and around the world. And the reasons for doing this actually on the platform, this speaks to the scale issue. There are multiple reports out there by the UC Davis, Union of Concerned Scientists, World Resources Institute, that shows that electrifying ride-hail is an incredibly impactful way to reduce carbon, because there are so many more trips that each vehicle takes. So the carbon impact is at minimum 3 times more than if you were to electrify the second or third vehicle of any household. Ride-hail electrification has to be equitable. The people earning on gig platforms are primarily low income and people of color. And so it's really important that we're thinking about ways of supporting that transition fairly. The majority of policies in the last couple of decades focused on electrification have focused the efforts on upper middle income households, on the second or third car. It's sort of the car that you might take out on the weekends. This is a working vehicle with doing lots of trips, and it's for people that have not been the focus of design, marketing, policies, resources. Whoop. I think I need to go backwards. Hang on one second. So one major part of this is then to support drivers in the transition to EVs. We're doing this in 4 different ways, but I actually want to take a little time. I'm in a room with, talk about sustainability, I'm in the lead building, so the room, its lights just dim because it thinks that no one's in here, but I think you can still see me okay. And the first thing we're going to do, actually, this has never happened. The first thing we're going to do was make education much more, make the choice of an EV much more transparent. So this, you can see how much you would earn, what your savings are. The second is to provide incentives for drivers, so that if you are in the EV, you're being rewarded for doing that right now. The third is savings. We all know that EVs are expensive right now. Charging infrastructure is fragmented. It's not always available. And in some cases, it doesn't, the economics, the total cost of ownership economics don't necessarily work out. So we looked at that ecosystem and are trying to push as many savings to drivers as well. I wanted to highlight also just a couple of the ways that this shows up for consumers. So you can order an EV in the app right now. We are also expanding micromobility through our partnership with Lime. We're in over 100 cities now. And just as a just as a different reference point, when we were directly operating JUMP, we were in over 20 cities. So there's a multiplier effect here by having that partnership. And we also have transit access in the app. This talks a lot about the growth of micromobility and transit products. But what I wanted to point out is what we're able to do here is kind of reinforce these modes together. So if you're in ride-hail ride, the driver will get an alert if they're dropping you off on the bike lane. Or if you're ordering something from Uber Eats, you have an option to go pick up with a scooter. So we're trying to kind of build these connections at the moment. It's still early, but we're trying to do that. The parts where I really want to kind of talk about here is the mutually reinforcing policies and actions across public, private, and NGO sectors. What we're seeing is that you need to bring all of these different pieces together in order to make the change that we're seeing, that we would like to see. And one thing that I wanted to share was a London case study, which we're just starting to get the early, feedback from. I actually lived in London right before I left London in 2002. So I remember when the city was starting to get ready for the congestion charge, and it was really remarkable that the city was doing that. But then along the way, it really did and pursued a lot of different other initiatives in that ecosystem of sustainable mobility that I was talking about. There was the bike superhighway. They really worked through their bus operations and performance metrics. They were they contracted out a lot of the services and really tried to find the best matches between operations and service provision. And they had a great performance metric for buses, which was that no one should wait any longer than 5 minutes. So 5-minute frequency is the kind of reliability that really helps people take transit. They launched a Streets as Places initiative and pedestrianized all sorts of major squares in the city. They looked at making transit stations, true hubs of economic activity, and were able to do some value capture and real estate development related to it to continue to fund transit. And they had shared mobility launches at the same time. They had car share, they had I would say that this is an area where things are still being sorted, not totally worked out, but there's a lot of new services that are now in the City of London. But because the streets they've been given more space because of all these other efforts that came along beforehand. What's interesting to me is doing all those things in the sustainable transportation ecosystem is what allowed London, or built I would say the political will, or contributed to building the political will for launching the ultra low emission zone. And that is essentially, more efficient vehicles, or less efficient vehicles have to pay a charge. So it's in addition to the congestion charge, and they have to pay a charge into the center of the city. And in response to that, Uber had launched a clean air plan. This clean air plan was really interesting as well, because it essentially was a complement to the ultra low emission zone. It was essentially giving drivers, it was adding a fee of 3 pence per kilometer traveled that went into a fund that was meant to support drivers a transition to EV so that they could basically enter the zone without the cost. And so far, we've raised 145 million pounds to support drivers. 5 million pounds have been devoted to charging infrastructure in low-income neighborhoods. We've helped 12,000 drivers get into EVs. And now the impact is that there's 8 times more electric vehicle kilometers compared to the rest of Europe. So this is a bit of the analysis that we're doing. And the blue is European countries. The yellow are key European cities. We have a report called the Spark Report that just shows the reinforcing policies that made certain cities take off compared to others. The line that you see that goes across is a benchmark of the zero emission vehicle share of all private car registrations. And essentially the bars, the blue and the yellow, are the vehicles on the ride-hail platform, on our platform. So there's, because of these efforts and because of the city policy, plus our policies and our desire to make, to also support electrification, we were able to get more scale, to move faster, to get that adoption rate higher. And what we see then in London is that, you know, there's this really fast pace of growth in terms of EV adoption and EV kilometers traveled, 8 times more in the first half of 2021 compared to the rest of, to the benchmark, the share of EVs in the general population. So that scale I was talking about in terms of why I wanted to do this at a place like Uber was starting to come alive in this case, in this situation. And I would say that this is data that we've been tracking since I got here. I've been here for about 2.5 years. So I wanted to share a few other stories about how then this ability to, you know, green the vehicles on the platform and fill the needs of people as they're moving around right now, as you know, and needing to, you know, live their lives and get things done. It's just something that I think we need to do at the same time right now. Oh, let's see. So we are helping the Sergo Foundation provide rides for moms. There's a really high incidence of maternal mortality in certain regions, and pre and postnatal care has been an incredibly important way for mothers for maternal health. And so we're undergoing a research study there. We've been partnering with transit agencies quite significantly, especially in areas where there isn't much density and they're seeing incredible need. In Cecil County, Maryland, there's a very high population of senior citizens and also incidence of opioid addiction. And so we just started with this pilot with them, which is to provide rides for residents of addiction recovery houses. And it's just been incredible in a 60-day period to see that missed appointments decreased so significantly, and that people found jobs within 9 days versus 31 days. Really, really significant impact in such a short amount of time. Sometimes with these examples, I just think that, of course, it's no surprise that giving a ride to someone who is in need and trying to take care of other parts of their lives helps them, but it's not necessarily the way that we're structured to do things. And so I do think it's worth just highlighting how important it is to meet people where they are, fill their needs today, as much as we're also working on that transition for tomorrow. We're also doing some interesting work right now in Ukraine. We had operations in Ukraine. Right now you're able, if you approach, the Poland border, Poland-Ukraine border, and you open the Uber app, you're able to get a ride into Poland free. And we're working with relief agencies along that border to help support the refugees as they come over the border as well. So I just want to end with that, those examples, and to say that, you know, all of these examples are things that we were able to do as a private company, but only in partnership with cities, with the regulators, with NGOs, with lots of different partners, researchers. It's not, I fully recognize it's not something we can do on our own, but hopefully that these examples show that technology can be a tool to fill the gaps of today, to maybe facilitate the transition for tomorrow. And it's a force. movement, just being able to focus on helping people move and do the things that they need to do is a force that helps bring us together. So thank you. With that, I'll end my talk and we can go to Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Shin-pei. And thank you for continuing to enlighten us even as you're in the dark there.
And maybe I'll go and try to turn on the light, but I think I'm okay. You can see me okay, right?
Yeah, we can see you fine. Our questions are piling up, but I wanted to start by asking a couple of things. I think one of the most intriguing things about an interrelated transportation system that's equitable is the ability for a ride-hailing company such as Uber to partner with a transit agency to help provide access for people maybe of modest means who live in low-density areas. You showed a slide there of I think a county in Maryland where and you had some positive results. Can you talk a little bit about precisely how that works and what that partnership consists of? Just a little bit more specific detail about that so we can get a sense of how those partnerships work.
Yeah, no, it's such a great question. And I do think that this is a very kind of nascent and still exploratory part of the business, but there's a lot of potential. In this case, we have a contract with the transit agency to provide certain rides. They're subsidized because it's part of a public health program for the county, and essentially they use the technology to dispatch. So it's like you can order the ride on demand, and they use the technology to dispatch. And the user accounts are centralized. They can the people who are kind of overseeing the users and the people in the addiction recovery houses can really be supportive and kind of see how they're, if they're able to, fulfill the different aspects of the program, that there's different things that they have to go through and fulfill as being a part of the program. So it's much more run through a public health lens, but the partnership is with the transit agency, and essentially the rides are covered, but mostly it might be with actually the vehicles owned by the county, but the dispatch technology.
I see. So, so we've seen in public transit over a long period of time, dial-a-ride services which are suboptimal. And I think what you're saying is the dispatch technology can take that same kind of idea and optimize it. Sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. And we have a business in Uber Health, which is HIPAA compliant. Patient privacy is completely protected. A doctor can order a ride through as a prescription, and no one has opened the app, and it's just to help people not miss appointments. So there are a lot of efforts like that where the technology ends up being an enabler.
You also used a phrase I never heard before, which is mobility insurance. I think I know what you mean by that, but you were saying that particularly during the pandemic, lower income folks or folks who live in lower income neighborhoods started using ride hailing as mobility insurance. Can you talk about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked about that. We're seeing more and more evidence that there are people that depend on ride hail as a way of, as an alternative, as insurance when they miss the bus.
As a backup.
As a backup, or when they were gonna ride their bike, but it started to rain, or maybe the bus, during COVID there were a lot of service changes, so suddenly there was a service change and something happened. So we're starting to see more and more of those kinds of results in the rides, and really what it is a approximation, because what we're seeing are in that map I showed, it was East New York. We zoomed in because we were like, why is East New York, why is rides recovery in April or May to September or December of 2020 faster in East New York than in Upper West Side Manhattan?
Right, it's counterintuitive, right?
Right, it's counterintuitive, and it turned out that people, there were a lot of rides to parks, and it's a place that doesn't have a lot of green space. And they were a lot of rides to a Staten Island, particularly a place where there are a lot of warehouses. So maybe there are a lot of workers getting to work just when and using ride hail's insurance to get there, just as the MTA had to cut service because of COVID safety reasons. So these are probably transit riders, which is fantastic, or they had other ways of getting there, but they couldn't make that happen during this really, this crisis and during the pandemic, and use ride hail as a backup.
I want to turn to the audience questions now. And again, I want to invite audience members to ask questions in the Q&A. And if there are questions that you like, click like on them and they'll move up. We have a few questions. I would love to see more. I think you addressed this a little bit, but but Larissa Jacobs has a question which I think has a little bit different twist. You talked about your relationship with Lime, but she asks, are there current partnerships with Uber to scale micro mobility opportunities? And she's particularly interested in the relationship, I think, between micromobility and healthy communities. Where are you going on micromobility? You have this one important partnership. Do you intend to scale it? And what's the relationship between, say, micromobility and scooters and ride hailing?
Well, yeah, this is really, really great question. Thank you, Larissa. We are hoping to continue to expand the availability of micromobility on the platform so that when people open up the Uber app, they see a scooter or a bike option, just as they might see a ride option. And I think just surfacing that, I think, is important, just as surfacing transit options is important. This question, though, is really dependent on the operations of the micromobility companies. And I think there's still a long way to go to figure out the best ways that those companies' operations are working in communities for healthy communities. The one place where I can think of, the one example I can think of, which was really during the pandemic, there was a lot of effort to help essential healthcare workers use micromobility as a way of just keeping them safe. But I think that there's other areas to go into with, especially health equity. It is very challenging for a micromobility operator to operate in places that are lower density, and those places in the majority of large cities in the US tend to be where there's affordable housing. So there's a bit of a mismatch there, but it is possible, I think, with agency support. It's just not going to be like a business opportunity at the face value.
Have you seen agency support for micromobility as an alternative, say, to transit or specialized or on-demand transit, anything like that? Or, as you say, is there a density question there that just can't be overcome?
Yeah, it's been emerging city by city, I have to say. So in New York, it's been amazing. Their bike share system is breaking records every single week for ridership. Part of that is, there's low car ownership there already, that people tend to be transit riders. Transit service hasn't completely been back, right? So the bike share ended up being the stopgap measure, and then maybe people used ride hail and other things as the insurance, as the other backup.
Yeah. But in New York, bike share has essentially become mobility insurance.
I think so. I actually think bike share in New York has become, in a way, another part of the transit system, because people often use it to go cross town, where it's like hard to go cross town in some cases, or as you branch out in the outside of Manhattan, it's hard to go in between lines, and bike share ends up filling those gaps.
Okay. We have a question from Paresh Patel. As an interim solution to transitioning to an EV fleet, can you discuss how Uber is enabling offsetting, I believe, your tailpipe emissions? What are you doing in the you're promoting
Yeah.
EV ridership. What are you doing in the, are you offsetting emissions in the meantime?
We're looking into this. Some of the other regions are using offset right now. We are actually really looking at all the other opportunities before we get to offset. We don't want to give ourselves an out right away. But one of the ways that we're doing this actually, which we think will be pretty cool feature, as you know, as a tech company, is to show consumers their emissions impact. That might be an interesting way to start to educate people about the choices they're making, because in some sense you could say that Uber prices, right, is providing a pricing system for different transportation choices. And so then if you add the emissions accounting side, that might give people another input into their decision in real time.
I want, before I go back to the questions from the audience, which are piling up now, I just wanted to go back to the EV question. If you could talk a little bit more specifically, you made a very interesting point that EVs have been targeted to basically higher income folks, and yet your drivers, or the gig economy drivers, are generally not higher income folks. So you're trying to find ways to incentivize them to switch to EVs. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about where you are in that, and what you're doing and where you're going?
Yeah, we actually partner with Grid Alternatives and EV Noir, two NGOs that have been a part of engaging with policy change and these transitions, but with a focus on Black and Brown communities. And they actually, you know, the data shows that people on the platform are primarily lower income Black and Brown, but they actually arrived at this because they talk so directly with communities, and they are working so, they have members, you know, EV Noir has a membership of Black and Brown drivers that really want to, who consider themselves to be advocates for electrification. So some of the ways that they were talking about the experience of trying to encourage their community to explore EV options was frankly really discouraging. The way that the marketing even is set up, or how do you go and test drive, or any kind of exploration you might do as a consumer for those options, is just frankly non-existent for those communities. And then second, charging infrastructure. It's really easy to set up charging infrastructure if you own your house and you have a garage. Lower income households tend to live in apartments, have no control over that kind of infrastructure, it's totally up to the property owners. And so there's this mismatch in both vehicle acquisition and charging infrastructure. The last thing is on policy with vehicles. Often it's, you know, a tax credit or something where you have to submit some kind of, it's like after the fact. That's sometimes really tough for lower income households to do. They may not actually be submitting, you know, anything like that, so they won't receive the benefit of that policy.
So both the financial incentives and the infrastructure are basically set up for middle class and above folks. Interesting.
Exactly.
Let me go to another question here. This is kind of interesting. The surcharge in Europe seems like an interesting way to fund EV initiatives. Are there examples in the States, such as the Massachusetts surcharge, that is directed back to trip origin communities? I'm not familiar with that situation.
You know, right now, that's a great idea. I would love to hear other people's ideas about this, because what I found actually when I look at, you know, like ride-hail fees in most places, very rarely does it actually go back to funding transportation improvements. It happens in a few places. A lot of times the city is trying to raise revenue for general funds. We have a principle that if these conversations are active and there's some kind of fee, we would love to see it go towards transportation funding, sustainable transportation funding. We're very supportive of congestion pricing for that reason, but for it to support transit improvements and other ways to reinforce that ecosystem I was talking about.
Steve Yaffe asked an interesting question. Would Uber consider a second software? You've talked a little bit about low density communities and partnerships with transit agencies. He's asking, would you consider a second software option for more isolated communities, focusing on zoning a driver or two to connect a particular neighborhood with a transit hub or nearby grocery and pharmacy with a discount? He says similar to jitneys in other countries.
Yeah, that's interesting. And package delivery. So right now we do a lot of package delivery too.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think we may see more and more of this happening. I wouldn't even say it's a driver or two, but in a lot of these more isolated communities, let's say this is happening in the UK right now, we have a partnership with local fleets in some of the smaller towns outside of the big cities to onboard the fleets to the platform so the matching happens more efficiently and the fleets get higher utilization.
When you say local fleets, what do you mean by that?
Like a lot of those towns have cabs and they have taxis, they have like cars, like they're informal jitneys. Yeah.
And so you're getting them onto the platform.
Yeah. So they can get on the platform, but maybe it's the cab company. So they still work for the cab company and it's a local fleet. Maybe there's some kind of agreement that the drivers have with that local company. Maybe the company owns the vehicles, but the company onboards the vehicles and the drivers onto the platform, and the matching happens that way.
Elizabeth Howley asks, you talked about partnerships with transit agencies, but do you see the possibility of partnerships with corporations? She says, thinking that with a labor shortage and mobility issues, that might be a solution. Have you talked about contracting with corporations for their commuters or anything like that?
We have a very healthy Uber for Business division, line of business. And basically that is what they do. They actually, there's several hundred of those accounts where we're providing the entire suite of transportation options for their employees. And it's everything from micromobility, the ride hail, bigger vehicles, shuttles, and we do this across the world. What's really fascinating to me about those partnerships with corporations is that they often are on the leading, if they're big, well-known brands like Apple, they're on the leading edge of also the sustainability conversation. So they're requesting us to be as green as possible as we're providing those services too. So there's in my mind, a nice mutually reinforcing effect there where they're able to bring the volume of of business, but there's this requirement that we try to make it as green as possible.
Back to the point you made about bringing the local taxi fleets or whatever, or jitney fleets onto your platform, there is a question. Somebody says, when I was in New York City, I was struck that normal yellow cabs could not be ordered through a phone app, while this was possible for Uber. I think in some cities, cabs are now on some platform or other. Do you see a trend toward that, or what's going on there?
Yeah, actually, we have a growing what we're calling new mobility products, and one of the fastest growing aspects of that are hailables. So systems that are the street hail system. Those vehicles and drivers can get on the Uber platform and be discoverable that way. And you probably will see more and more of those kinds of things happening around the world, if not in the US.
I actually remember one day in downtown Houston, I ordered an Uber and a taxi cab showed up. and it was somebody who he's with a cab company, but he also is on both the Uber and the Lyft platform. So I think you see that kind of thing more and more often.
Yes. Yes.
We have a question here about high schoolers. One population that could benefit greatly from the Uber transit collaboration are high schoolers. What are the challenges you see there? Challenges working with minors, or are there other challenges there?
And with working with minors, I assume we're talking about minors as like the user, the person,
yeah, right,
passenger.
Right. Not as the driver.
I know. It's like there's a whole host of problems, but maybe not problems, but challenges. Actually, we used to have a product that was, I think, Uber for kids or something like that. But hear you on this, and so one of the things that that resulted from the Future of Cities report, which I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested, was talking about filling these utility gaps, right? So how would you convince a house to potentially drop a car trip and not take that car out? And a lot in the school, like, ferrying your teenagers from different activities is one of those big, intensive uses, right? So we're actively looking at ways of filling those gaps. And I think the family use case is a very strong one. So
when you say the family use case, like you say, there is potentially tremendous savings and more flexibility if there is a car that a family does not need to buy, right? And you buy,
yes,
you basically buy transportation by the trip. But do you see? I mean, I know both in my own case and with many others, there's always the question of, okay, how old does my kid have to be before I put him in a ride-hailing vehicle, right? I don't know what the rules, I don't know what the laws are about that, but that is a difficult judgment for a parent to make.
Yeah, I would say, and unofficially, I do think a lot of parents do it today because they have no better option. And making it more of a product feature means that there's some, waivers or liability kind of agreements. And then maybe there's special kind of additional education for drivers who sign up to be eligible for those rides.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a conversation about, there's a legal aspect in terms of the risk, but then there's also just a social aspect to it.
Right. There's a question here again from Paresh Patel about air pollution and air quality, wondering I'm going to paraphrase. That's a rather technical question. To what extent do you think about both the airborne transmission of viruses to your riders and your drivers, and the impact of air pollutants that result from traffic for the people riding in the vehicles that your drivers drive, not your vehicles, sorry.
Yeah, well, there was an interesting study that came out recently about local air pollution as a result of transportation, and specifically cars, and whether or not we were moving in the right direction. And on the ride-hail platform, there's actually, because there are these, on the mobility side, because there are fuel efficiency minimums, there's a threshold you have to meet in order to carry a passenger. There's actually a higher and better local air pollution mitigation effect on the ride-hail, if you look at the vehicles on the ride-hail platform compared to the general population of vehicles. So that's one piece of it. But the second piece is just, how are we protecting passengers and drivers from COVID, for example. And I think we were one of the first companies to put in place a lot of the safety measures that are now standard. Wearing mask is required in every single ride. Even today, we shut down pool right away. We're still re-examining whether or not to bring that back, and there's some trade-offs, right? Because we're losing the utilization and vehicles moving more people. But I think what's also interesting about this is people don't realize how much exposure is out there in general, and that local air pollution is something that everyone really needs to be contributing to. So there was a really interesting study that came out of that was focused on Paris because they have the Vili bike share system, and they have, you know, hundreds of kilometers of bike lanes in the city now. So there's a lot more people out of cars and actually moving around and moving themselves around on the street. And there was a study that showed an increase in respiratory illnesses, and they were attributing it to, right, I'm not sure this is totally all of Vili's fault, but they're attributing to the increase in bike riding, actually, because there was just more exposure. That's really all it is.
Right.
If you're looking at the public health side, it's epidemiological, so it's just about the population effect. And so there's a lot to say here about all of those effects on a population level.
Interesting. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And I wanted to go back and ask a little bit about. Actually, I want to go back and ask you a little bit about London, if I can take a minute to do that. You had some very interesting information about London and the path that London has taken. London has a congestion zone. I don't think any place in the US has a congestion zone other than Manhattan, if I'm not mistaken, lower Manhattan. That is to say, you need to pay a fee to enter with a car. But then one thing that I didn't quite follow was that later on, London created a low emission zone. So what does that mean, and how do different modes of transportation fit into that?
Yeah, good question. So the congestion zone is really a reducing number of vehicles policy, right? You create a cordon, and you're using pricing as a way of helping people decide whether or not they're going to cross the line into the center of the city. The ultra low emission zone, when they got to it, it was more about carbon and air pollution. So there actually are quite a few diesel vehicles in Europe still. We also, part of our commitment to be 100% was to actually, by 2025, not have any diesel vehicles on the platform. And so that is really more about fuel efficiency and being part of the a climate plan. So those two things need to work together, right? You can't just have fuel efficient vehicles, but then have a ton of congestion and people not being able to bike, walk, or take transit. And having the city full of cars. If they only had the ultra low emission zone, you could have a lot of fuel efficient cars, but it would still be maybe not a great walking environment.
Right, it might still be congested. Yeah.
Yes. So with both, you get the carbon impact and you get the space saving impact.
Okay. All right. Suzanne Rickles asked about bikes. She mentioned how you've talked about micromobility, including bicycles, but noted that many people don't know how to ride bikes. So is that, we often talk about travel training for transit riders so that they understand how to navigate the transit system. Is there, I guess you might call it travel training for bicyclists, or there's increasing demand in certain cities for bikes, but what about people who aren't familiar or might be afraid?
That's a great question. So Suzanne, if you're writing this from Houston, there's a great bicycle advocacy organization, Houston Bikes, I think. And
Bike Houston.
Bike Houston, so yeah, Bill would know. But usually a local advocacy organization will have learn to ride sessions. And I think it's never too late. There's a way for adults to learn in one session. And it happens, I think they happen quite frequently. So I would encourage you to look for those kinds of things. And so basically you just take off the pedals of a bike, lower the seat so your feet can touch, and just learn to glide around on a bicycle. And before you know it, you're riding a bike. These are for able-bodied people. It's a privilege though, to your point. It's a privilege, it's for able-bodied people. And so it's not beyond learning. There are a lot of new vehicle types, right, for other kinds of mobility. So that's pretty cool too.
And then Paul Gore asks about Uber Eats and was wondering if you have any statistics or information on how Uber Eats might have helped restaurants during the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. We actually did a survey of merchants, the impact of Uber Eats for merchants during the pandemic. And it was pretty incredible. I was surprised by the outcome. 85% of the merchants surveyed said that they wouldn't have survived the pandemic without Uber Eats or third-party delivery platforms. Specifically, they said Uber Eats, but there was a lot of people had increased revenue. They were able to weather the open up shutdown effort aspect. And so I would encourage you to, I can also send that out if people are interested. It's the Merchant Impact Survey. But the other thing that we did during the pandemic, because in many large cities, indoor dining was compromised, and we made a commitment to support Black-owned businesses as a result of the George Floyd protests and the whole racial equity movement. We stood up a few pop-ups for restaurants to both to expand their dining spaces and help them do that. A lot of restaurants don't have the resources or the maybe the design access to make those things happen. And we released a book about the different ways restaurants could repurpose space around them to expand their dining so that they weren't so affected by the cut in indoor dining. And that was really amazing. Because of that work, there were some restaurants that took an opportunity to rebrand because they had a new parklet, a dining parklet. There are restaurants that weathered it a lot better. So we did that in a few places and are continuing a program in Atlanta.
We have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to go back and you mentioned Uberpool a while ago and how you shut it down right at the beginning of COVID, which made sense. But Uberpool has always struck me as a really interesting bridge between driving or ride hailing alone and then riding on transit. So, relatively inexpensive, flexible. If you're willing to spend a little more time getting to your destination, where have you, and I've noticed Uberpool before you shut it down was not in every city. It was only in some cities. I'm just kind of wondering what role and demand do you see for something like Uberpool in the future? Would you expect to see that rolled out in more cities, or what market conditions have to be present for it to be successful? Is it something that you can do in combination with transit agencies, for example?
Yes, yeah. So the kinds of places where Uberpool works really well is when there's really good supply of drivers, and so it's demand, and it's pretty balanced. Right now, supply, as everyone may be reading the news, is pretty challenged.
Yes.
And I also want to point out, often when we, as people who really care about mobility, talk about the passenger experience and all of those things, we forget about the driver. They really hated the way Pool was structured before. They often didn't know where they were going. I don't think it was. There was a lot of feeling of loss of control. So those are actually some of the considerations as we're thinking about relaunching Pool, is where is there enough supply, one, and where we are restructuring Pool so that it's not such a horrible experience for the driver. And the way that it's been launched in Australia right now is you can opt in for a potential Pool ride. And if someone happens to be going the same direction, they'll do it and the driver is compensated accordingly. But the driver knows. And so there's a little bit more like opt-in on both sides. And that has, I think, has helped quite a bit. I think we also might have launched it in Miami. So that probably, you can imagine, there's a bit better supply situation there. But there needs to be supply to make it work.
Yeah, and supply of drivers, you mean? And supply of drivers has indeed been a challenge coming out of. You've had great. My observation as a rider of ride hail services is you've had great fluctuation in supply over the last few months, and of course in Houston we just came out of the rodeo. Which there's a huge supply problem during the rodeo. What are you doing to try to increase supply? I mean,
Yeah, I think the last couple of years, was a real reckoning about, how responsive the company should be to concerns of the drivers, and obviously way more responsive and way more supportive, and to have
Interesting.
greater empathy about the challenges that they face, and what it's like to be on a car, and what it's like to have that uncertainty as you're picking people up. And the vast majority of people do it because they like it, or do it because they know they're going to get a certain earning, or they're filling income gaps. But there's just a greater sense of empathy, and it's not just, it can't just be that, right? There has to be action. So there have been quite a few incentives to help to increase supply and help people, reward them for driving on the platform. And even with the gas prices recently, having quickly coming up with a fee per trip that's passed through to the driver to cover
the cost. Yeah.
And there's no take on it. It's really directly to the driver, and having greater transparency around each of the trips. Those are a lot of ways. So there's just a lot of ways that we could, I think, be doing more for drivers.
Okay. Well, Shin-pei, we're out of time. Thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us today. Very interesting and informative, and always good to see you. During our next Urban Reads event on April 13th, technology historian Peter Norton will discuss his book, Autonorama, The Illusory Promise of High-Tech Driving. And as many of you are looking forward to, the Kinder Institute luncheon returns in person on May 17th. Here are the findings from the 41st Kinder Houston area survey, and in particular, help us honor Steve Kleinberg as he retires after conducting the Houston area survey for 41 years. We will also be honoring community leader and historian Ann Chow. And our next KI forum, similar to this, will feature journalist Scott Beyer on May 25th, discussing how a free market approach to housing, transportation, and public administration can create more livable cities. You can register for any of these events by visiting kinder.rice.edu, or I think we have the QR code up. The QR code is, if you see the QR code on your screen, you can just scan that and to go to our website. But the website is pretty simple, kinder.rice.edu. So again, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Shin-pei, for being with us, and we'll see you next time.